I'm a 34-year-old guy, and I guess you could say I've been living a double life. Not in the spy thriller kind of way, but in the I have way more money than anyone knows way. Let me back up a bit to explain how this all started, because it's been one hell of a journey to where I am now. I grew up in a lower middle class household. My parents were the kind of people who worked hard, stretched every dollar, and taught me to appreciate what we had, even if it wasn't much. College wasn't in the cards for me financially, so I started learning to code on my own in high school. It became my obsession. By the time I was 20, I had launched a small tech startup with a couple of friends. We worked out of my parents' garage and ate ramen every night. Things took off faster than we expected. Within 5 years, our company got acquired by a major corporation. My payout? 8 figures. It still feels unreal to say that. I was 25 and suddenly had more money than I could comprehend. But instead of buying a mansion and a flashy car, I kept things simple. I stuck with my old mid-range car, wore the same jeans and hoodies I always had, and moved into a modest apartment. The way I saw it, I didn't want to change who I was because of the money. Fast forward a few years, I met my wife, Emily, at a coffee shop. She's an art historian, smart, funny, and beautiful in a down-to-earth way that made me feel like I'd hit the jackpot. We bonded over a shared love of old books and late-night conversations about everything from philosophy to bad movies. When we started dating, I decided not to bring up my financial situation. It wasn't like I was lying about it, I just didn't want my money to be the thing people saw first. So I told her I was a freelance developer, which was technically true. I still took on small projects here and there to keep busy. Things got serious quickly, and within 2 years, we were married. Her family, though, that's where things got complicated. Emily comes from old money. Her parents live in a house that could be mistaken for a small palace. Her dad is a CEO, her mom spends her days hosting charity galas, and her siblings all have fancy degrees and high-paying jobs. From day one, they made it clear they didn't think I was on their level. The first time I met them, I drove up to their estate in my 10-year-old car, wearing what I thought was a nice sweater and jeans. I could feel their eyes scanning me, and not in a friendly way. Her dad asked about my job, and when I said I was a freelance developer, he nodded like I'd said I was unemployed. Her mom smiled politely but kept steering the conversation toward Emily's potential and how she deserved someone who could match it. Emily tried to smooth things over, but it was clear they thought I was a downgrade. The snide remarks started small, a comment about how a simple wedding was so charming and not what they were used to, or how I must be a great budgeter since I didn't splurge on gifts during family events. I let it slide at first because I didn't want to cause drama, and Emily didn't seem to want to push back either. Things came to a head last Christmas. Emily and I had agreed on a modest gift exchange because we were saving up for a house, or so they thought. Her family, on the other hand, turned their annual gift exchange into a spectacle. When it was my turn, I handed out thoughtful but inexpensive presents, a leather-bound journal for her mom, a classic board game for her dad, and handmade candles for her siblings. I thought they were nice, but the room went quiet. Later, one of her cousins posted a meme on Instagram about men who can't provide, tagging me. It wasn't subtle. The tipping point was a dinner a few months ago. Her dad took us out to a high-end restaurant and, in the middle of the meal, loudly offered to pay for my meal since money might be tight. The table chuckled awkwardly, and I just sat there, fuming. Emily looked embarrassed but didn't say much, which hurt even more. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I've kept my wealth hidden because I wanted people to see me for who I am, not for the number in my bank account. But her family? They'd been judging me for years, thinking I was some broke loser who got lucky with their daughter. If they wanted a show, I was about to give them one. I spent the next week planning a way to set the record straight, not to show off, but to stop the endless passive aggression once and for all. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for myself and the life Emily and I had built together. What happened next changed everything. Stay tuned, because the reveal, let's just say they weren't ready for it. Update 1. The week after that disastrous dinner with Emily's dad, I decided it was time for things to change. Emily and I sat down at home one evening to talk about what had been happening. I laid everything out, the snide comments, the Instagram meme, and how her dad's stunt at the restaurant was the final straw. Emily didn't argue. She said her family could be overbearing and rude, but asked if I really needed to go to extremes. I told her this wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. Her plan started to form. If her family was so obsessed with appearances, maybe it was time to give them one they couldn't ignore. I booked a private room at a high-end restaurant downtown, the type of place that makes her parents feel like royalty, and invited the whole family under the pretense of wanting to improve our relationship. They loved the idea, thinking I was finally trying to impress them. Little did they know, this dinner wasn't going to go the way they thought. On the night of the dinner, I went the extra mile. I rented a luxury car, something sleek and ridiculously expensive, and picked up Emily in it. She rolled her eyes when she saw it, saying it was unnecessary, but I told her it was part of the plan. When we pulled up to the restaurant, her family was already waiting outside. The second they saw the car, they froze. Her dad raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Her mom looked like she was trying to piece together what was happening. Inside, the private room was set up with all the bells and whistles, candlelit table, personalized menus, and an open bar. Her family seemed impressed but also confused. Her dad made a comment about how this was a bit ambitious for someone on a freelance budget. I just smiled and let it slide, knowing what was coming. The first half of the dinner went as expected. Her dad dominated the conversation, talking about his business successes and how he recently upgraded his yacht. Her mom chimed in occasionally, steering the conversation toward how Emily could have married someone more secure. Meanwhile, the cousins whispered to each other, glancing at me like I was some kind of alien. The food came out, and the jabs kept coming. Her dad joked about how I must have saved up all year to afford the meal. Her mom laughed, saying it was nice to see me making an effort for once. What they didn't know was that I had already taken care of the entire bill before we even sat down. I'd arranged with the restaurant staff to keep it discreet until the end of the night. I let their comments roll off me, focusing on what was about to happen. When dessert arrived, I decided it was time. I leaned back in my chair, looking relaxed, and casually mentioned that I had a funny story to share. Everyone stopped talking and turned to me. I started by saying how much I appreciated their patience with me over the years. Her dad smirked, clearly thinking I was about to grovel. Then, I dropped the bombshell. I told them I used to own a tech company, which I had sold to a major corporation in my mid-20s. The room went silent. Her dad broke the silence with a laugh, saying that was a good one. Her mom smiled politely, clearly not believing me. I pulled out my phone and opened an old article about the acquisition. It had my name in bold letters alongside the multi-million-dollar figure. I slid the phone across the table. Her dad's face went pale as he read it. Her mom blinked rapidly like she couldn't process what she was seeing. One of her cousins whispered, "No way," under his breath. Emily, who had always known I was wealthy but not to this extent, looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. The questions started pouring in. How much was I really worth? Why didn't I say anything before? Was I hiding money? I calmly explained that I had kept my wealth private because I didn't want it to affect my relationship with Emily or how people treated me. I didn't want to be judged for my bank account, especially not by people who didn't even try to get to know me. Her sister was the first to apologize, saying she had underestimated me and respected how I had built my life. Her mom, however, accused me of misleading the family and playing games. Her dad sat in silence, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't long before he tried to change the subject, but no one was buying it. The power dynamic at the table had shifted completely. Emily surprised me by stepping in. She told her family she was proud of me for standing up for myself, and that she was tired of them treating me like I wasn't good enough. Her dad looked like he wanted to argue, but her mom held his arm, probably realizing they were out of their depth. By the end of the night, the atmosphere was tense. Some family members, like her sister, seemed genuinely apologetic, while others, like her dad, were clearly trying to figure out how to regain control. When the bill came, the waiter quietly told the table it had already been taken care of. Her dad opened his mouth to protest, but then thought better of it. As we walked out, the looks on their faces were priceless. For once, I wasn't the one trying to prove myself. And this was just the beginning. Update 2. The drive home after that dinner wasn't exactly peaceful. Emily sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out the window. She broke the silence once to ask why I had to go so far. I explained it wasn't about showing off, it was about putting an end to years of judgment and passive-aggressive digs. She didn't argue much, but I could tell she wasn't thrilled with how public it all was. Still, she admitted her family's behavior had been out of line for too long. The next day, it became clear just how much the dinner shook things up. Word spread through Emily's extended family faster than I expected. By lunchtime, her phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Some were curious relatives asking if the story about my tech company was true. Others were more aggressive, accusing her of hiding the truth and humiliating her parents. Emily sighed every time a new message came in. Later that afternoon, her mother called. Emily put the phone on speaker so I could hear. It wasn't an apology. Instead, her mom criticized me for making the family look bad by flaunting my wealth. She said I should have given them a heads up if I wanted to make a spectacle. Emily defended me, reminding her mom of all the times they'd disrespected me. But the call ended on a sour note. As if that wasn't enough, her cousins started stirring things up online. One of them posted a passive-aggressive meme about humble beginnings, tagging another cousin who commented something about gold-digging men. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't funny. I didn't respond, but Emily saw it and immediately messaged them, telling them to cut it out. Instead of stopping, they doubled down, sharing more memes about hidden fortunes and fake modesty. Emily grew more frustrated by the day. She called her mom and sisters, asking them to stop the gossip. Her younger sister, Julia, the one who apologized at the dinner, was the only one who seemed genuinely supportive. Julia admitted she was impressed by my success and said she respected how I'd kept it private. She also let slip that some family members were now bitter because they felt I'd upended their idea of how things should be. Apparently, her parents weren't as financially secure as they made it seem, and my reveal had made them look vulnerable in front of their social circle. 2 days later, I got an email from one of Emily's cousins, the same one who had mocked me online. He didn't apologize for the posts or his past behavior. Instead, he asked if I could get him a job at my company. He said he was impressed by what I'd built and wanted to learn from someone with my experience. The kicker? My company doesn't even exist anymore. I sold it years ago. I ignored the email. By the end of the week, Emily and I went to a family brunch her parents had planned. Walking into the room felt like stepping into an ice storm. Her dad barely looked at me, her mom plastered on a fake smile, and the cousins avoided eye contact altogether. The meal was tense, with her parents making passive comments about financial responsibility and the cousins whispering amongst themselves. A few of them asked intrusive questions about how I invested my money or why I'd hidden my wealth. I kept my answers vague and polite. Halfway through, I overheard a hushed conversation between her dad and one of her uncles. They were talking about debt, big debt. It sounded like her dad's business wasn't doing well, and the expensive lifestyle they flaunted was more of a show than a reality. It explained why my reveal had hit them so hard. I didn't bring it up to Emily right away, but I filed it away for later. That night, Emily admitted she was overwhelmed. She said her family had always used their wealth as a way to control people, but now she was seeing how toxic it had become. She worried about how all the drama might affect our relationship, especially with her parents putting so much pressure on us. We talked for hours and decided to set some firm boundaries. No more letting her family walk all over me. We'd attend events on our terms, and if things got out of hand, we'd leave. Just as we were starting to feel some relief, a message came through from her dad. He was calling a family meeting and wanted both of us to attend. No explanation, no details, just a time and place. Emily was hesitant, but I told her we should go. Whatever her dad was planning, I wanted to hear it firsthand. Something told me this wasn't going to be just a casual chat. The invitation left us both uneasy, but one thing was clear, the fallout from that dinner wasn't over. Update 3. The family meeting was set for Saturday evening at Emily's parents' house. By the time we arrived, the tension in the air was so thick, it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Their massive living room, usually a place for showy gatherings, was unusually quiet. Her dad stood at the far end of the room, arms crossed, while her mom sat stiffly on the couch. Emily's sister, Julia, gave us a small nod as we walked in. A few other family members were scattered around, avoiding eye contact. The meeting started abruptly. Her dad didn't waste any time explaining why we were there. He outlined how their family business, a long-standing company her dad had inherited, was facing serious financial trouble. It had something to do with bad investments and declining revenue over the past few years. The numbers he threw out were staggering. He admitted they were in deep debt and needed a lifeline. Then came the pitch. Her dad turned to me and proposed a partnership. He said with my resources and expertise, I could help save the business. He threw in some buzzwords about family unity and how this was an opportunity for me to prove I was truly committed to their family. The room went silent as everyone waited for my response. I declined. Politely but firmly, I told him that mixing family and business rarely ends well. I explained that while I sympathized with their situation, I wasn't comfortable risking my hard-earned wealth on a venture I knew nothing about. Emily stayed quiet beside me, but I could tell she was bracing for what came next. Her dad's face turned red. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, claiming I was letting the family sink when I had the means to help. He said I didn't understand what it meant to support family because I didn't come from one like theirs. I stayed calm, repeating that my decision wasn't personal, it was about being cautious. That's when Emily stepped in. She reminded her dad that we had no obligation to bail them out and that this was a problem caused by their own decisions. Her dad shot her a look of disbelief, like he couldn't believe she was taking my side. Her mom finally spoke up, pleading with Emily to reconsider and saying that this was a chance to bring the family closer together. Then the bombshell dropped. Her dad admitted that the business wasn't just struggling, it was on the verge of collapse. He had taken out several loans to keep it afloat, and now they were drowning in debt. He'd been banking on my money to turn things around. The room erupted. Some family members blamed her dad for the mess, while others turned on each other, accusing people of bad management decisions or not contributing enough to the business over the years. I stayed quiet, letting the chaos unfold. When things calmed down a little, I explained to the room that my wealth was hard-earned. I told them that I'd spent years building something from scratch and wasn't about to throw money into a sinking ship without proper due diligence. That's when one of Emily's cousins lashed out. He accused me of pretending to be poor just to humiliate everyone. He called me manipulative and said I'd disrupted the family dynamic for no reason. Emily's mom broke down at that point, saying she'd been under so much stress trying to maintain their lifestyle and appearances. She admitted that she and her husband had been hiding the extent of their financial troubles from everyone for years. Her dad didn't take it well. He stood up and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Julia, as always, was the voice of reason. She apologized on behalf of their parents and said she was embarrassed by how everything had played out. She pulled Emily aside and told her she supported us no matter what. A few other family members murmured their agreement, but the division was clear. Some people sided with her dad, blaming me for upsetting the status quo, while others acknowledged that the family's issues ran much deeper than my involvement. As things started winding down, I made a surprising offer. I told them I'd be willing to hire an independent financial advisor to review the family business. The goal would be to figure out if there was any way to salvage it without me directly investing. I made it clear that the process would have to be completely transparent and that I wouldn't get involved unless they followed the advisor's recommendations. Her dad eventually came back into the room, his face still flushed with anger. He begrudgingly agreed to the idea but warned me that I'd regret getting involved. I didn't respond to that. Emily and I left soon after, leaving the family to stew in the aftermath. On the drive home, Emily thanked me for offering a solution but said she wasn't sure her dad would follow through. I told her I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it to give the rest of the family a fighting chance. What came next would depend on how willing they were to face the truth. The ball was in their court now. Update 4. The independent financial advisor I hired arrived the following week. His reputation was solid, and I made it clear that his job was to provide a completely unbiased assessment of the family business. Emily and I stayed out of the way, letting him meet with her dad, review documents, and speak with employees. From what little I heard, the process wasn't going smoothly. Her dad was resistant from the start, arguing that the audit was unnecessary and a waste of time. The advisor pressed on. Over the next few days, he uncovered what I had suspected but didn't fully expect. The business was a mess. There were loans taken out against assets that were already leveraged, suppliers that hadn't been paid in months, and employee payroll issues that were barely patched over. The biggest shock came when the advisor hinted at potential tax fraud. It wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. There were deliberate efforts to obscure income and inflate expenses. The findings were presented at a family meeting. The advisor laid everything out with cold precision, charts, numbers, and a detailed report. It was brutal. Her dad sat there, stone-faced, while her mom kept glancing around the room, clearly uncomfortable. The accusations started almost immediately. Her dad blamed her mom for overspending, while her mom fired back about his reckless business decisions. He then turned on his business partner, who wasn't even present, claiming he'd been misled. I stayed out of it, reminding everyone that the advisor's role was to provide facts, not opinions. But the room wasn't having it. A few family members began turning on me, accusing me of digging up dirt just to embarrass them. One cousin, who had been vocal against me since the dinner reveal, claimed this was all part of a power play to make the family look bad. Emily did her best to mediate, but it wasn't working. Her dad's frustration boiled over at a family gathering a few days later. He accused me loudly of ruining his reputation. He claimed that without my interference, the business would have rebounded on its own. The room fell silent as he ranted about how I had no right to judge a legacy I wasn't part of. Julia stepped in at that point, siding with us. She called out her dad for deflecting blame and pointed out that the issues had been brewing long before I entered the picture. Her support meant a lot, especially since most of the family was either avoiding the conflict or siding with her dad. The tension came to a head at yet another family meeting. This time, her dad wanted to discuss next steps for the business. The advisor was invited back to present a restructuring plan. It was a solid strategy that would give the company a chance to survive, but it came with a major condition: her dad would have to step down as CEO. The advisor argued that his leadership was part of the problem and that a fresh perspective was needed to regain trust from investors and employees. I reiterated my offer to help fund the restructuring, but only if her dad agreed to step aside. He refused outright. He called the suggestion an attack on his authority and stormed out of the room, leaving the rest of us to pick up the pieces. Emily, frustrated, stood up and announced that we were done with the drama unless her dad agreed to the plan. She told the room that our marriage and mental health came first, and we wouldn't keep putting ourselves in the middle of a mess we didn't create. The family began to splinter after that. Some relatives quietly reached out to Emily and me, expressing support and apologizing for how things had escalated. Others, like the vocal cousin, doubled down on their hostility. Her dad dug his heels in, refusing to budge or even acknowledge the advisor's recommendations. The business continued to spiral, with rumors circulating that creditors were preparing to take legal action. Julia, as always, was our rock. She helped Emily navigate the growing rift in the family and even started talking about pursuing her own ventures separate from the family's influence. Meanwhile, Emily's mom stopped attending gatherings altogether, clearly overwhelmed by the fallout. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get more chaotic, her dad dropped a bombshell. He announced that he'd made a final decision about the business and would be revealing it at a family event the following weekend. The cryptic nature of the announcement left everyone on edge. Was he going to sell the company? Declare bankruptcy? Refuse to step down and let it crumble? Emily and I debated whether to even attend. We both agreed that we didn't want to be dragged into another spectacle, but part of me felt compelled to see it through. After everything that had happened, I needed to know how this chapter would end. Whatever her dad's decision was, it was clear the family would never be the same. Update 5. The family gathered for what was billed as the final decision meeting at her parents' house. The tension was undeniable as everyone took their seats in the grand living room. Emily and I stayed close to the back, observing as her father stood at the center, holding a folder that looked like it contained the business's financial documents. The room was packed, with cousins, uncles, and aunts whispering among themselves, speculating about what was coming. When her father finally spoke, his voice was calm but cold. He announced that he was liquidating the family business. The debts, he explained, had become insurmountable. There was no realistic way to save the company without massive sacrifices that he wasn't willing to make. He said this was his decision, and it was final. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the room. A few relatives jumped up, begging him to reconsider, offering ideas that felt more like desperate flailing than actual solutions. Others, however, immediately turned their attention to me. The accusations came fast, claims that I had forced his hand by digging into their finances and refusing to help. One uncle even stood up, pointing at me, and said that if I had just invested a fraction of what I had, none of this would have happened. Emily quickly stepped in, reminding everyone that the problems with the business predated me and that her father had made his own choices. Her calm but firm tone silenced most of the room, at least for the moment. Her father, however, didn't seem interested in defending himself. He simply stood there, letting the chaos unfold, occasionally glancing in my direction with a mix of resentment and defeat. Emily and I stayed silent, letting the family air out their frustrations. When the financial advisor suggested a restructuring plan to salvage some of the business's assets, her father shut it down immediately. He said the family had lost too much already, and he wasn't willing to let outsiders meddle in what was left. His pride was still intact, even as everything else crumbled around him. The advisor tried to explain how the plan could minimize losses and allow them to rebuild in the future, but her father dismissed it outright, insisting that liquidation was the only option. As the meeting wrapped up, the reality began to sink in. Some family members left immediately, clearly furious at how everything had played out. Others lingered, huddling in corners to whisper about what they'd do next. The family's once unified front had completely fractured. Those who had blindly supported her father were now questioning his leadership, while others quietly distanced themselves from the whole ordeal. The fallout wasn't limited to the family. News of the business's closure spread quickly through their social circles. It wasn't long before whispers about debts, mismanagement, and the sudden involvement of a financial advisor made the rounds. Her parents' carefully curated reputation took a significant hit, and Emily's mom stopped attending social events altogether. Emily reached her breaking point soon after. She told me she was done with the constant drama and guilt tripping. For years, she had balanced her loyalty to her family with the realities of their behavior, but this was the last straw. We agreed to set clear boundaries. From now on, we'd only attend family events on our terms, and any discussions about money or the business were off limits. Julia, as usual, was the one family member who truly had our backs. She decided to distance herself from the chaos too, saying she was tired of being caught in the middle of fights she didn't start. Over the next few weeks, she spent more time with us, and her bond with Emily grew stronger. She even started talking about launching her own business, inspired by the independence I had shown in handling my career. Emily, ever the optimist, suggested family therapy for her parents, hoping it might help them work through their issues. Predictably, her dad scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as unnecessary. Her mom seemed more open to the suggestion, but ultimately deferred to her husband's judgment, as she always did. Before we fully stepped back, I had one final conversation with her dad. It was short and to the point. I told him my intention had never been to humiliate or undermine him, but to protect the life Emily and I were building together. I said I respected the legacy he had built, but that the choices he had made were his own, and he needed to own them. He didn't argue. Instead, he nodded stiffly and admitted, begrudgingly, that he had underestimated me. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement I was going to get. Life after the fallout felt lighter. Without the constant weight of her family's expectations, Emily and I found ourselves focusing on our own goals. We traveled more, spent weekends exploring hobbies we'd neglected, and even began discussing long-term plans like starting a family. Julia became a regular fixture in our lives, her positivity and ambition a refreshing contrast to the drama we'd left behind. The family hasn't completely healed. Some members have cut ties altogether, while others maintain a strained, distant relationship. But for the first time, Emily and I feel free to live on our terms, without judgment or interference. It's not the resolution I envisioned when this all started, but it's one I can live with. And that, in the end, is what matters most.